Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. We met in the silence of a cold marble corridor, not as lovers, but as two names on a misplaced piece of paper. He was supposed to marry my cousin, Gemma, a woman who wore diamonds like armor and sought transactional status. Instead, he got me, a quiet archivist with a family debt that felt like an inescapable shadow. But some mistakes are meant to be kept. The corporate suite of Julian Marcus Sterling was a fortress of glass, brushed steel, and uncompromising efficiency. I sat alone on a rigid leather sofa in the reception area, my hands resting on the worn cover of my sketchpad. It was an old companion, its pages filled with historical notes, a stark contrast to the sterile world I was about to enter. I traced the leather with a thumb, still stained with indigo ink. Choices vanish quickly. When you're poor, when your mother is dying, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. His financial ruin came from a desperate attempt to fund her medical treatments, leaving a ledger of liabilities so severe it became a suffocating net. It was a net Gemma had initially agreed to lift by marrying the reclusive Tycoon. She thrived in the spotlight, craving the power of the Sterling name. But when a clerical error placed my name on the preliminary drafts instead of hers, and she realized the freezing isolation of Julian's highly regimented lifestyle, she balked. She tore up her dress fittings and left the burden entirely on me. And so I found myself waiting in the crushing quiet of his corporate sanctuary. I held my breath, listening to the rhythmic ticking of a wall clock, waiting for the frosted glass door to open. When it did, Julian stepped into the room, bringing with him a palpable drop in temperature. He was an imposing, detached figure carved from winter stone. His dark charcoal suit seemed to absorb the ambient light. There was no warmth in his gaze, no hesitation in his stride. He looked at me not as a prospective bride, but as a solved equation, a finalized transaction that would satisfy his board while clearing my father's ledger in a single stroke. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice was low, devoid of inflection, a baritone sound that reminded me of heavy steel vault doors swinging shut. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, keeping my voice steady. I stood up slowly, clutching the sketchpad to my chest. I refused to let him see how small I felt in this massive space. He gestured for me to follow him into his office. The expansive room was dominated by a mahogany desk. On its center lay a single folder containing the marriage license, the document that would seal my fate, binding me to a man who only required my physical presence on paper. "The fundamental terms have not changed," Julian stated, moving behind the desk. He did not offer me a seat. "Your father's creditors have been satisfied. The debt is erased. In exchange, you will assume the public role of my wife for the agreed-upon term. You will reside exclusively at my estate. You will not interfere with my corporate work, nor make public statements." "I understand," I said quietly, my voice barely breaking the silence. I stepped forward, looking down at the cream-colored paper. There it was, printed in stark black ink, Maeve Vance, not Gemma. The ridiculous clerical error had become the anchor of this transactional reality. I traced the printed curve of the M in my name. The paper was utterly cold to the touch. I was signing away my quiet life among the dusty archives, all to pay for financial sins I had never committed. Julian smoothly unscrewed his silver fountain pen. He signed the designated line with unfeeling precision. The scratching sound of the metal nib echoed loudly. To him, this was a necessary corporate merger required to finalize his control over the Sterling Empire. He held the pen out to me. I took it from him. The polished metal was faintly warm from his grip, a startling contrast to his freezing aura. I looked up. His jaw was rigidly set, his eyes focused entirely on the document. He was building a massive wall between us before the ink had even dried. I leaned down and carefully wrote my name beside his bold signature. My handwriting was small, a deliberate script honed by years of transcribing fragile historical documents. There was no music playing, no soft vows exchanged, just silence. The transaction was complete. I placed the pen back on the desk, the metallic sounding like a heavy lock snapping shut. "My driver is waiting downstairs to take you to the estate," Julian said, turning to examine a monitor. "I will arrive later this evening. Do not wait up." I did not wait to be dismissed twice. I walked out of the office, my sensible shoes muffled by the thick carpet. I had sold my future to clear a ledger, but I would not sell my dignity. The solitary drive to the coastal New England estate was a hypnotic blur of gray skies and damp fog. The further the vehicle moved from the city, the more the world faded into a washed-out watercolor of dark pines and churning ocean water. I sat quietly in the back seat, watching raindrops trace erratic paths across the tinted glass. I brought nothing with me but a modest suitcase and 2 heavy leather bags containing my personal family archives. When the car finally slowed, the massive Sterling estate emerged from the coastal mist like a forgotten fortress. Built of cold stone and towering glass windows, it merely reflected the somber sky. It was a grand monument to isolation, deliberately designed to keep the unpredictable world firmly locked out. The iron-studded oak front doors opened before I reached the top of the slick stone steps. Standing in the imposing threshold was an older woman with a posture as rigid as the marble pillars. She wore a dark, immaculate uniform, her gray hair pulled into a tight knot. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice crisp but not entirely unkind. "I am Agnes Finch, the head housekeeper." The formal title felt like a soaking wet coat draped over my shoulders. I offered her a tight, guarded smile. "Please, just call me Maeve." Agnes blinked, a microscopic shift in her stony expression. Her sharp eyes darted to my ink-stained fingers, then to the worn leather bags I stubbornly insisted on carrying myself. A silent understanding passed between us. She had prepared the house for Gemma, a woman armed with demanding requests and designer luggage. Instead, she was looking at a deeply reserved archivist who only wanted to fade seamlessly into the background architecture. "Mr. Sterling explicitly requested that we wait for him in the main foyer," Agnes said smoothly, stepping aside. I stepped cautiously into the cavernous entrance hall. The vast expanse of polished white marble looked like a frozen, dangerous lake. The air smelled strongly of natural beeswax, sharp lemon polish, and an underlying chill that seeped immediately into my bones. There was absolutely no warmth here, no comforting scent of baking bread, no scuff marks to indicate a life that was actually lived. It was entirely sterile. We waited together in profound silence. I stood perfectly still, my fingers locked tightly onto the strap of my archive bag, breathing in the cold air and refusing to display any impatience. An hour later, the front doors opened again, and Julian stepped inside. He brought the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and impending coastal rain with him. He paused momentarily, his dark eyes scanning the massive foyer until they landed securely on me. He looked mildly surprised to find me standing exactly where I had been instructed, making no demands, causing no disruption to the silent order of his home. He handed his heavy coat to Agnes with a dismissive nod, turning his full attention to me. The space between us felt like a massive chasm, filled entirely with unspoken, rigid boundaries. "I prefer uncompromising clarity and order in my home," Julian began, his deep voice echoing against the high stone ceilings. "You will be quartered permanently in the East Wing. My private rooms, my personal gym, and my study are located entirely in the West Wing. You are not to enter them under any circumstances whatsoever." I nodded slowly, absorbing the aggressively clinical nature of his demands without flinching. "We will dine together exclusively on Thursdays at precisely 7 o'clock, he continued, his gaze drifting to the window. "It is mathematically necessary to maintain appearances for the estate staff. Aside from that single hour, our lives will remain entirely separate. You have a generous allowance, deposited into a private account. Do not ask me for anything else." He was actively building the defensive walls incredibly high and thick, ensuring I understood my exact, diminutive place in his massive world. I was merely a ghost he had purchased, with his immense wealth to balance a corporate ledger. "Is that clear, Maeve?" he asked, finally shifting his dark eyes back to look directly at me. "Perfectly clear," I said, my voice steady enough to carry across the cold marble floor. I met his analyzing stare with calm, entirely unyielding acceptance. "I require very little, Julian. You will hardly know I am here." A sudden flicker of something, perhaps deep confusion, perhaps strange relief, crossed his sharp features for a fleeting second before the heavy iron mask of stoic detachment slid smoothly back into place. Without another word, he turned his back and walked away toward the forbidden West Wing, his leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone until the vast silence swallowed him, whole. Agnes cleared her throat softly. "If you will follow me to the east wing, ma'am." I followed her obediently up the sweeping, dramatically curved staircase. I navigated the dimly lit corridors, as if I were walking cautiously through a grand museum after closing hours, terrified of disturbing the priceless exhibits. The specific room Agnes finally showed me into was incredibly vast, undeniably beautiful, and utterly lifeless. Heavy, silver-threaded drapes framed a set of exceptionally tall windows that overlooked a sprawling, neglected garden far below. The central bed was massive, mode, covered in pristine white linens that looked as though they had never been touched. The pale gray light of the late afternoon spilled generously across the polished hardwood floor, casting deeply isolating shadows. "I can have a maid unpack your things and arrange the closets," Agnes offered gently, lingering near the doorway. "No, thank you, Agnes. I prefer to do it myself," I replied quietly, maintaining my polite but firm boundary. She nodded in understanding, instantly recognizing the invisible line I was drawing, and gently pulled the heavy door closed. I was left entirely alone in the suffocating silence of my new reality. I walked straight over to an antique oak desk, situated squarely near the drafty window. I carefully set my worn leather bags on the floor and slowly, methodically unbuckled the thick brass straps. Deliberately, I began to unpack my family archives. I lifted the delicate, yellowing historical documents with the utmost care, placing the bound, cracking leather journals of my late mother alongside the fragile charcoal sketches I had made as a child. I arranged them meticulously on the sterile surface of the desk. The incredibly comforting smell of old paper, dried archival ink, and degrading binding glue began to slowly, defiantly push back against the overwhelmingly sterile scent of the perfectly cleaned room. I ran my sensitive fingertips over the faded handwriting of a mother I now barely remembered. The rough texture of the aged paper was imperfect and wonderfully human. In this cold transactional estate, where I was supposedly nothing more than a legal obligation, these fragile pieces of history were my only true sanctuary. I pulled out my sketch pad and a fresh piece of soft charcoal. I sat down on the chair by the drafty window, feeling the sharp coastal chill seeping steadily through the glass and settling deep into my weary bones. Outside, the rain began to fall in absolute earnest, beating a steady rhythm against the cold pane. I looked down at the vast, overgrown mess of the dark garden below, noting the faint, ghostly outline of a crumbling Victorian greenhouse hidden among the choking weeds. I took a slow, trembling breath, allowing the reality of my new life to finally settle over me. The cold transaction was officially over. The deep, heavy isolation had truly begun. But as I pressed the charcoal firmly to the rough paper, listening to the quiet scrape of the carbon against the page, I realized with profound certainty that I was not entirely defenseless. I had my quiet dignity. I had my unyielding resilience. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. And in the oppressive silence of this massive, empty house, I would patiently build my own sanctuary, one small, unnoticed corner at a time. The first few days at the Sterling estate blurred into a monotonous rhythm of profound, unbroken isolation. The massive house operated with the clinical precision of a well-oiled machine, governed entirely by the strict rules the man who owned it had laid down. I rarely saw him. Julian departed for his corporate headquarters, long before the coastal fog lifted from the manicured lawns, leaving behind only the faint, metallic scent of ozone and the heavy weight of his absence. Agnes, the head housekeeper, moved through the corridors like a shadow, ensuring my meals were perfectly prepared and entirely solitary. I was a ghost haunting the East Wing, a quiet complication that had been neatly categorized and filed away in a luxurious, sterile box. But I was never meant for a life of idle, pristine confinement. My hands were accustomed to the rough texture of ancient paper, the binding glue of decaying archives, and the purposeful ache of continuous labor. The flawless white marble of the mansion offered nothing to anchor my restless mind. It was too cold, too perfect, and utterly devoid of human friction. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. I felt that silent pull on the fourth morning, when the gray skies finally broke to reveal a pale, watery sunlight. Leaving the suffocating perfection of my designated quarters, I wrapped a thick woolen cardigan tightly around my shoulders and ventured out into the sprawling, neglected garden that lay hidden behind the immaculate front hedges. The air here was entirely different. It was heavy with the rich, loamy scent of damp earth, rotting pine needles, and the sharp tang of the nearby ocean. I navigated through a labyrinth of overgrown rhododendrons and wild, thorny briars until I stood before the structure I had glimpsed from my bedroom window. The Victorian greenhouse was a forgotten masterpiece of wrought iron and sweeping glass arcs, deeply swallowed by decades of relentless ivy. It looked like the skeletal remains of a great ship that had wrecked upon a green shore. Many of the lower panes were entirely opaque with grime, while others were completely shattered, allowing the wild elements to reclaim the space within. I gripped the rusted iron handle of the main door. It protested with a harsh, grating shriek, yielding slowly to my determined weight. Stepping inside, I was instantly enveloped by an atmosphere that felt wonderfully, terrifyingly alive. The air was thick with the scent of trapped petrichor, ancient terracotta, and the sweet decay of forgotten botanical ambitions. Dead vines hung from the vaulted ceiling, like tattered lace curtains. Rows of wooden staging tables groaned beneath the weight of hundreds of overturned, soil-caked clay pots. It was a beautiful, chaotic ruin. It was exactly what I needed. I did not return to the sterile mansion to ask for permission. I did not ring a silver bell to summon a team of landscapers. Instead, I simply pushed my sleeves up past my elbows, knelt directly onto the cracked stone floor, and began to work. The physical labor was incredibly demanding, grounding me in a reality that felt far more authentic than the transactional marriage contract, locked in a corporate safe. I started with the heavy clay pots, lifting them one by one. The coarse terracotta scraped against my palms, leaving behind a fine reddish dust that mixed with the dark, damp soil. I cleared the decaying root systems from the ceramic vessels, dumping the dead matter into a large canvas bin I had found rotting in the corner. Hours dissolved into the repetitive, exhausting rhythm of clearing and sorting. My fingernails became packed with dark earth. My knees ached from the hard stone. I welcomed the discomfort, not because I harbored a desire to punish myself, but because the sharp, undeniable sting of physical exertion proved I was still alive, still capable of shaping my own environment. My cousin Gemma would have been utterly horrified by the filth. She viewed dirt as a moral failing, a sign of the lower classes she had always strived to escape. To me, the soil was a blank canvas, a quiet sanctuary where I was not a debt to be managed, but a woman with agency. By the afternoon, I turned my attention to the opaque glass panels framing the eastern wall. The heavy calcium deposits and hard water stains had formed a thick, crusty barrier against the sunlight. Lacking proper tools, I found an old rusted trowel and used the dull edge to chip away the worst of the buildup. When the metal proved too cumbersome, I used my bare fingernails, scraping desperately against the frosted surface. The sound was a harsh, rhythmic rasping that echoed through the empty structure. Small flakes of white powder snowed down onto my dark sleeves. My cuticles bled slightly, stinging in the cold air, but the glass slowly began to clear, allowing a weak, beautiful beam of amber light to finally pierce the gloom. I paused, breathing heavily, resting my forehead against the cold, newly cleared pane. A sudden prickle of awareness washed over the back of my neck. It was a visceral sensation, a silent alarm that I was no longer entirely unobserved. I turned slowly, wiping a streak of dirt from my cheek with the back of my wrist. I looked up through the glass, my gaze tracing the imposing, gray stone facade of the mansion until it reached the towering windows of the west wing. He was standing there. Julian's silhouette was perfectly framed by the massive window of his private study. He was a dark, unmoving pillar against the bright, sterile lighting of his corporate sanctuary. The physical distance between us was vast, crossing an expanse of wild gardens and manicured lawns, yet his focus was absolute. I could not see the expression on his face, but the sheer intensity of his stillness was palpable. He was watching me. The immaculate Tycoon, a man who traded in billions and demanded uncompromising perfection, was silently observing his legal wife, kneeling in the mud, her hands bleeding as she scraped dirt off forgotten glass. I did not shrink away. I did not attempt to hide my soiled clothes or smooth my tangled hair. I simply stood my ground in the center of the ruined greenhouse, holding his distant gaze. I raised my chin, a quiet declaration of my own boundaries. This broken, dirty place was mine. He could rule the marble fortress, but he would not dictate the terms of my survival out here in the earth. After a long stretching moment, the dark figure turned slowly and disappeared back into the depths of the West Wing. The connection severed, leaving me alone once more with the comforting silence of the plants. 2 weeks passed in this newly established rhythm. My days were spent entirely in the dirt, coaxing fragile green shoots from the restored clay pots, while my evenings were spent in the silence of the East Wing. The unspoken truce shattered abruptly on a Tuesday evening. The coastal weather, which had been mildly damp and forgiving, suddenly pivoted with brutal violence. The local radio in the kitchen crackled with an urgent frost warning, predicting a severe, unexpected plunge in temperature that would bring freezing winds off the Atlantic. Panic gripped my chest with icy fingers. I had just finished transplanting a series of incredibly delicate hellebore sprouts into the wooden staging tables nearest the southern wall, the very wall where a massive, jagged hole remained in the glass, a pane I had not been able to repair. I had covered the gap with heavy plastic sheeting, but it would never withstand a true coastal freeze. The fragile roots would die long before dawn. I paced the floor of my bedroom that night, watching the condensation freeze into delicate, fractal patterns on my own windows. The wind howled against the stone architecture, a mournful sound that rattled the heavy frames. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. I wanted to run out into the storm. I wanted to carry the heavy terracotta pots back into the warmth of the mansion. But the strict rules forbade me from bringing dirt or disorder into the sterile environment. I was entirely trapped by the transactional boundaries of my own marriage. I spent the dark hours sitting by the glass, my knees pulled to my chest, mourning the inevitable loss of the only living things I had managed to nurture in a desolate place. When the first pale light of morning finally bled through the gray clouds, I did not wait for Agnes to begin her rounds. I threw my heavy coat over my nightgown, shoved my bare feet into my worn leather boots, and rushed out into the biting cold. The frost had turned the overgrown lawn into a treacherous landscape of brittle, white shards. Every breath plumed in the freezing air like smoke. I hurried toward the greenhouse, my heart sinking with each step, fully expecting to find a graveyard of blackened, frozen leaves. I grabbed the iron handle, pulling the heavy door open. I stopped dead in my tracks. The anticipated blast of freezing air did not hit my face. Instead, the atmosphere inside the greenhouse was remarkably stable. It was not warm, but it was sheltered, carrying a soft, humid resilience that defied the bitter frost outside. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my boots making no sound on the damp stone. I approached the southern wall, my eyes scanning the staging tables. The delicate hellebore sprouts were perfectly green, their small leaves completely untouched by the killing frost. I looked up. The heavy plastic sheeting was gone. In its place, fitting seamlessly into the curved wrought iron frame, was a brand new pane of thick tempered glass. I reached out with a trembling hand, pressing my fingertips against the edges of the newly installed window. The industrial putty holding the heavy pane in place was still soft. It yielded slightly beneath my touch, feeling incredibly tacky and fresh. The distinct, sharp scent of linseed oil and metallic glaze hung heavy in the cold air, completely overpowering the smell of damp earth. Someone had been out here, in the dead of night, in the freezing wind. I turned around, my breath catching sharply in my throat. Resting on the center of the wooden staging table, placed carefully beside a row of newly sprouted ferns, was a heavy canvas roll. It was tied neatly with a thick leather strap. I approached it with extreme caution, as if the object might suddenly vanish. My fingers fumbled with the cold leather buckle, unrolling the thick canvas to reveal a set of heavy-duty, professional gardening tools. There was a pruning shear made of brushed steel, a soil knife, and a beautiful, heavy-handed spade. I picked up the spade. The wood was incredibly smooth, polished to a dark, rich finish that felt heavy and substantial in my palm. My thumb brushed over a subtle indentation near the base of the handle. I tilted the tool toward the morning light. Carved into the dark wood, with precise, uncompromising, deeply etched lines, were 2 letters, M.V. Maeve Vance. Not Gemma, not a generic replacement bride, not a nameless liability erased from a corporate ledger. He had used my actual name. A profound, staggering wave of emotion crashed over me, so intense it forced me to grip the edge of the wooden table for support. The man who refused to speak to me, the tycoon who had built a fortress of rules to keep me at a sterile distance, had not simply hired a contractor. A landscaping crew would not have worked in the freezing dark. A hired hand would not have left custom-engraved tools resting on my workstation. Julian had come out here. The man, carved from winter stone, had stepped into the freezing night, handled industrial putty, and silently repaired the broken shield that protected my fragile sanctuary. He had done it without waking me, without demanding gratitude, and without compromising his stoic facade. I pressed the wooden handle of the spade against my chest, right over my wildly beating heart. I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of the fresh linseed oil. It smelled like safety. It smelled like the first terrifying crack in a massive wall of ice. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. I looked back at the new pane of glass, watching the harsh morning light filter softly through the flawless surface. I had signed a contract expecting a jailer, a cold financial transaction designed to keep me invisible. But as I stood in the quiet warmth of the greenhouse, gripping the tool he had given me, I realized a terrifying truth. The man who owned the sterile marble fortress had secretly warm, calloused hands, and he was already starting to build a home. The days that followed the silent repair in the Victorian greenhouse felt entirely different. The massive stone walls of the Sterling estate had not physically changed, nor had the harsh coastal wind stopped battering the tall, drafty windows. Yet, the architecture of the silence between us had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer a cold, sterile vacuum designed to keep two strangers separated by miles of polished marble. It had become a waiting space. It was a heavy, breathing quiet, filled with the faint, lingering scent of linseed oil and the unspoken weight of a single, custom-engraved hand spade resting on my wooden work table. I did not thank him. To offer a generic, polite expression of gratitude would have reduced his midnight labor in the breathing dune rain to a mere transaction, and we had both suffered enough from the rigid ledgers of debts and payments. Instead, I continued my work in the dirt, and he continued to watch me from the high windows of his corporate study. We were two deeply guarded people, slowly learning the shape of each other's shadows. It was the 14th night of our second month together, when the invisible boundary between the east and west wings finally dissolved. The estate was entirely asleep. Agnes Finch had retired hours ago, leaving the grand corridors bathed in the pale blue light of the moon reflecting off the ocean. I was restless, the familiar ache of physical labor humming in my shoulders. Seeking the small comfort of a solitary routine, I padded softly in my thick woolen socks down the sweeping staircase and into the cavernous main kitchen. The space was a masterpiece of modern, clinical design, acres of brushed steel and flawless white quartz that had never seen a spilled drop of flour or a chaotic family dinner. I ignored the sterile perfection of it all. I moved directly to the pantry, pulling out my own glass jars of dried herbs. I measured out the delicate, crushed flowers to brew a pot of lavender chamomile tea. It was a sensory anchor to a past life, a simple ritual my mother used to perform in our cramped, drafty apartment when the collection agencies called too many times in one day. The rough texture of the dried chamomile rubbed against my calloused fingertips. The sharp, soothing scent of lavender bloomed instantly into the cold air as I poured the boiling water into the heavy ceramic teapot. I stood by the island, wrapping my hands around a chipped mug I had brought from home, watching the steam curl upward into the dark. "You are awake." The voice came from the doorway, low and entirely devoid of the harsh, commanding edge it usually carried in his corporate office. I did not startle. Somehow the heavy, atmospheric pressure of the room had already warned me he was there. I turned slowly. Julian stood in the archway, completely stripped of his usual armor. Gone was the immaculate charcoal suit, the silk tie, the razor-sharp presentation of a billionaire tycoon. He wore a simple, dark-woven sweater and soft linen trousers. His dark hair was slightly rumpled, as if he had run his hands through it 100 times while reading complex financial reports. In the dim moonlight, the sharp angles of his face looked deeply exhausted, revealing the quiet, hidden toll of maintaining absolute control over an empire. The coastal wind makes it difficult to sleep, I answered softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I did not ask what he was doing in my designated half of the house. I simply accepted his presence. He stepped fully into the kitchen. The faint, masculine scent of cedarwood and ozone followed him, mixing seamlessly with the warm, herbaceous aroma of the steeping tea. He did not move to turn on the harsh overhead lights. He seemed to prefer the safety of shadows just as much as I did. He walked over to the quartz island, stopping mere inches from where I stood. The physical proximity was sudden and overwhelming. I could feel the ambient heat radiating from his large frame, a stark contrast to the persistent chill of the marble floor beneath my feet. I looked down at the heavy ceramic teapot. I was just making a cup. Would you like some? It was a small, entirely domestic offer. It was the kind of mundane question a real wife might ask a real husband after a long day. Julian looked at the steam rising from the spout, then down at my hands. He noticed the faint, permanent stains of dark soil worked deep into my cuticles, the small, healing scratches on my knuckles from clearing the thorny briars in the greenhouse. He did not look away in disgust. He looked at the evidence of my labor with a quiet, intense reverence. Yes, he said. I reached for a second mug from the drying rack. I grasped the heavy handle of the ceramic teapot. My right wrist, overworked from hauling heavy bags of potting soil all afternoon, trembled slightly under the sudden weight of the cast iron and boiling water. The pot tipped forward a fraction too fast. Before the scalding liquid could splash onto the counter, a large, warm hand closed firmly over mine. I froze completely. The sudden raw contact of his skin against mine sent a sharp, terrifying jolt straight up my arm. Julian's hand was massive, his long fingers wrapping entirely over my knuckles. I could feel the unexpected roughness of his own calluses. The physical proof that the man who now commanded boardrooms had once built his empire from the ground up. He did not pull the teapot away from me. He simply provided the necessary strength, steadying my trembling wrist, guiding the heavy spout until a perfect, amber stream of lavender chamomile tea poured neatly into the empty mug. The silence in the kitchen suddenly had teeth. It was a wild breathing thing, trapped in the narrow space between our bodies. I looked up. His face was only inches from mine. His dark eyes were intensely focused on the exact point where our hands remained locked together on the ceramic handle. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice a deep, rough vibration that I felt in my chest more than I heard in the room. I held my breath. I analyzed the immense, terrifying distance I would have to cross to drop the heavy armor I had worn since my father's financial ruin. I was terrified of being a temporary fixture, a debt payment that could be discarded the moment the ledger was balanced. But the heat of his hand over mine felt like an anchor in a world where I had been violently adrift. Not because I was brave, but because I was incredibly tired of being alone. I slowly relaxed my grip on the teapot. I did not pull away. I simply turned my palm upward, allowing his fingers to intertwine briefly with mine in the warm, fragrant steam. "Don't," I whispered back. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering rapidly beneath his skin. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, as if a massive, invisible weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. He gently released the teapot, though he let his fingertips drag softly across my wrist as he pulled away, leaving a trail of burning awareness in his wake. He picked up the steaming mug. We stood in the quiet kitchen, drinking the tea in a profound shared silence. When he finally spoke, he did not look at me, but kept his gaze fixed on the dark window pane. "My mother used to grow hellebores," Julian said quietly. The admission was incredibly rare, a fragile piece of glass handed to me in dark. She spent her entire life trying to keep them alive in a house that was entirely too cold for anything to grow. When she died, the landscaping crew tore them out to plant uniform hedges. It was more efficient. I closed my eyes, the sorrow of his confession settling heavily into my own chest. I understood now why he had stood in the freezing rain to repair the glass. He wasn't just protecting my sanctuary. He was quietly guarding a memory he had not been able to save as a child. My mother smelled like archival ink and old binding glue. I offered in return, honoring his vulnerability with my own. She spent her life cataloging the history of other families, trying to ignore the mounting debts of our own. When she passed, the creditors took everything. The only things I managed to save were the ledgers she wrote by hand. It's why I keep them in my room. It's the only place she still exists. Julian slowly turned his head to look at me. The guarded, detached Tycoon was completely gone. In his place was a man who recognized the exact shape of my grief, because it perfectly mirrored his own. He reached out, his warm knuckles brushing lightly against the side of my cheek. It was a fleeting, agonizingly tender gesture. "They cannot take anything from you here, Maeve," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying certainty. "The debts are gone. You are safe in this house." I leaned into the warmth of his hand for a fraction of a second before he dropped it. We finished our tea in a comfortable, healing silence, standing shoulder to shoulder in the dark. 2 days later, the fragile, quiet sanctuary we had built was violently invaded. It was Thursday evening. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7, signaling the start of the mandatory formal dinner. I had grown accustomed to these meals. What had started as a rigid, agonizing hour of forced proximity had slowly evolved into a quiet, peaceful ritual where Julian and I shared the vast mahogany table without the need to fill the air with meaningless chatter. I was sitting in my usual chair, wearing a simple, high-necked woolen dress. My hands were scrubbed clean, though the faint shadows of soil remained stubbornly beneath my trimmed nails. Agnes was just stepping into the room to pour the sparkling water when the heavy iron-studded front doors echoed with a loud, aggressive thud. The sharp, unmistakable sound of stiletto heels immediately began clicking rapidly across the marble foyer, completely shattering quiet dignity of the estate. "Julian, darling, you really must speak to the gate security. They actually tried to ask for my identification, as if I haven't been on the approved list since last summer." Gemma Vance swept into the formal dining room, bringing the chaotic, superficial glare of high society with her. My cousin was wearing a striking crimson designer coat, the collar pulled back to reveal a blinding array of diamonds resting against her throat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled into rigid waves, and the overwhelming scent of her heavy floral perfume instantly choked the subtle, clean air of the room. She stopped at the edge of the table, her perfectly manicured hands resting on the back of an empty chair. She had clearly come uninvited, assuming she still held the power to walk freely into the life she had abruptly abandoned. She expected to find Julian miserable with his transactional mistake. She expected to find me cowering in a corner, broken by the cold reality of the Sterling Empire. Julian did not stand up to greet her. He did not smile. He simply paused, holding his crystal water glass in mid-air, his dark eyes instantly freezing over into the impenetrable corporate mask he wore for the outside world. "Gemma," he said. It was not a greeting. It was a warning. She completely ignored his tone, turning her sharp, heavily lined eyes toward me. Her gaze swept over my simple woolen dress, landing immediately on my hands resting on the white linen tablecloth. A cruel, triumphant smile twisted her lips. "Look at you, Maeve." Gemma laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that echoed off the stone walls. "You can put her in a marble palace, Julian. But she still looks exactly like the hired help. Have you been playing in the dirt again? I always told your father that paying for your education was a waste of funds. A girl with dirt under her nails belongs in a field, not at a billionaire's table." I did not flinch. I did not pull my hands off the table to hide the faint stains of the earth. I simply sat perfectly still, maintaining my quiet dignity. I refused to let her loud, desperate need for dominance shrink me into a victim. "It takes hard work to restore something that has been neglected, Gemma." I replied evenly, my voice calm and completely unbothered. "But you wouldn't know anything about staying when things get difficult, would you?" Her eyes flashed with sudden, vicious anger. The polite socialite veneer cracked, revealing the ugly, transactional reality beneath. "Don't speak to me as if we are equals, Maeve," she snapped, stepping closer to the table. "You are only sitting in that chair because of a clerical error. You are a walking debt payment, a living ledger entry to clear your father's pathetic bankruptcy. Julian doesn't want you. He needed a signature, and you were desperate enough to sell yourself." She looked directly at Julian, waiting for him to agree. She was waiting for the cold, detached Tycoon to nod, to dismiss me, to confirm that I was nothing more than a purchased commodity occupying her rightful space. The silence that followed was absolute. Julian slowly placed his heavy silver fork down onto the porcelain plate. The metallic clink rang through the dining room like a gunshot. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell, or display a single ounce of dramatic rage. The shift in the room's atmospheric pressure was entirely driven by the sheer, crushing weight of his absolute stillness. He looked at Gemma as if she were a minor, slightly repulsive accounting error that he was about to permanently erase. "You seem to possess a catastrophic misunderstanding of the nature of my home, Gemma," Julian stated. His voice was a quiet, devastating blade, cutting cleanly through her heavy perfume and loud entitlement. Gemma's confident smile faltered. She took a small, uncertain step backward. Julian slowly stood up from the head of the table. His towering frame completely dominated the room. He did not look at her diamonds. He did not acknowledge her status. He looked only at me. "My wife is exactly where she belongs," he continued, his tone dropping into a lower, fiercer register that brooked absolutely no debate. "Her hands carry the soil of this estate because she is the only person who has ever brought life into it. You, however, are a trespasser, and you have overstayed your welcome by exactly 3 minutes." Gemma's face drained of all color. The humiliation was absolute, delivered without a single raised voice or loss of control. Julian had not engaged in a high society spat. He had simply removed her relevance with quiet, terrifying authority. He did not wait to see if she would cry or argue. He completely turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely. Julian walked slowly around the long mahogany table until he reached my chair. He extended his large, warm hand toward me. I looked up into his dark eyes, seeing the fierce, unwavering protection burning steadily beneath the calm surface. I placed my soil-stained hand into his. He helped me stand, his grip firm and infinitely gentle. "Agnes?" Julian called out quietly without turning his head. The housekeeper materialized instantly from the shadows of the hallway, her expression a mask of perfect, stony satisfaction. "Yes, sir. Please ensure Miss Vance is escorted off the property immediately. She is permanently removed from the security clearance list." "At once, Mr. Sterling," Agnes replied smoothly, turning a terrifyingly polite glare upon my frozen cousin. Julian did not look back. He kept my hand secured tightly in his, guiding me away from the lavish, untouched dinner and out toward the massive front foyer. He stopped only briefly at the heavy mahogany coat rack by the door. He reached up and pulled down his own warm woolen coat. It was a massive, heavy garment, lined with dark silk. Without a word, he stepped behind me and gently draped the heavy fabric over my shoulders, pulling the lapels closely around my neck to shield me from the draft. The coat instantly swallowed me in absolute warmth. It smelled intensely of cedarwood, cold winter air, and the quiet safety of his presence. It felt like a fortress built perfectly to my size. He opened the side glass doors, and together, we stepped out of the sterile, glowing mansion and into the dark, breathing earth of the overgrown garden. The cold night air immediately kissed my cheeks, but beneath the heavy wool of his coat, I was perfectly untouched by the chill. We walked in silence away from the marble walls, away from the transactional ledgers, and away from the diamonds that meant nothing. As the sound of Gemma's panicked, clicking heels faded into the distance behind us, I pulled the collar of the warm woolen coat tighter around my jaw. The debt was a ghost. The contract was just paper. As Julian's hand found the small of my back, guiding me gently through the dark, toward the faint amber glow of our restored greenhouse, I finally understood the truth. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. The amber warmth of the restored greenhouse faded long before the chill of my cousin's words finally took root in my mind. After Julian had guided me through the dark garden, wrapping his heavy woolen coat around my shoulders, we had sat together in the humid, earthy silence of the glass sanctuary. He had not offered grand declarations, and I had not demanded them. The quiet presence of his Malsfad beside me in the dark had felt like a definitive answer to a question I was too terrified to ask. But in the desolate, lonely hours before dawn, after he had finally returned to the West Wing to sleep, and I was left alone in my pristine, sterile bedroom, the dangerous reality of our situation began to settle over me like a suffocating frost. I sat by the tall, drafty window, pulling my knees to my chest as I stared out at the churning, black ocean. My cousin Gemma was a cruel woman, but her vicious insults were anchored in a terrifying legal truth. I was a clerical error. I was a walking debt payment, a living ledger entry designed to balance a financial catastrophe my father had left behind. Julian was a man of uncompromising honor and absolute corporate responsibility. He had defended me at the dinner table with devastating authority, permanently exiling Gemma from the property, but he had defended me as his wife. He had protected his household, his name, and the legal assets sitting at his mahogany table. I traced the cold condensation on the window pane, feeling the icy moisture seep into my fingertips. I didn't leave the Sterling estate because I was afraid of his imposing nature, nor did I flee because the massive marble fortress was too isolating. I left because I realized with sudden, absolute clarity that I had fallen completely, irrevocably in love with a man who was legally obligated to tolerate my presence. As long as the transactional marriage contract remained locked in his corporate safe, I would never truly know if his silent acts of service were born of genuine devotion or merely a rigid adherence to his own strict moral code. I refused to be a substitute bride, quietly accepting the crumbs of his duty while secretly begging for his heart. The morning sun rose behind a thick, impenetrable blanket of gray coastal clouds. It was going to rain. Rain. I did not ring for Agnes Finch, and I did not pack the expensive designer clothing that had been systematically deposited into my closets over the past 2 months. I dressed in the exact same faded wool trousers and oversized frayed sweater I had worn on the day I arrived. Before gathering my mother's fragile archival ledgers, I walked out of the massive front doors and crossed the manicured lawn toward the Victorian greenhouse one final time. The air was biting and damp, carrying the heavy scent of rotting pine needles and salt. I pushed the heavy iron door open, stepping into the quiet, humid sanctuary. I had painstakingly pulled back from the brink of decay. The delicate hellebores were thriving, their green shoots stretching confidently toward the new, flawless pane of glass Julian had installed during the freezing storm. I walked slowly down the central aisle, my boots making soft, rhythmic sounds against the damp stone floor. I stopped at my wooden staging table. I took a clean, damp cloth and methodically wiped down the wooden surface, clearing away the scattered potting soil and broken clay fragments. I picked up the heavy, custom-engraved hand spade he had left for me. I rubbed a single drop of linseed oil into the dark, polished wood, ensuring the metal was protected against the ambient moisture. I rolled the tools tightly into their heavy canvas, binding, and secured the thick leather strap, placing the bundle perfectly in the center of the clean table. Then, I looked down at my left hand. The heavy gold wedding band was a beautiful, unadorned circle that Julian had slipped onto my finger in his sterile corporate office. It had felt like an iron shackle then. It felt like a vital organ now. My chest ached with a sudden, violent hollow pressure as I gripped the edges of the ring. Slowly, deliberately, I slid the cold metal over my knuckle. It left a pale, indentated ghost of a circle on my skin, a physical reminder of the phantom life I was leaving behind. I found a small, dusty terracotta saucer, sitting near a stack of empty clay pots. I filled the shallow dish with a handful of dried lavender buzz I had harvested from the overgrown hedges near the eastern wall. I placed the gold band perfectly in the center of the crushed purple flowers. It was not an act of anger, nor a dramatic display of rejection. It was a quiet, deeply respectful resignation. I was returning the immense wealth he had placed upon me, leaving it in the only place in his massive empire that felt truly real. I walked back to the east wing, strapped my heavy leather bags shut, and quietly slipped out of the side servants' entrance. The walk down the long, winding driveway was grueling, the heavy bags cutting deeply into my shoulders, but I did not stop, and I did not look back. By the time I reached the local train station, the sky had broken, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. I bought a one-way ticket to my childhood town, paying with the small handful of cash I had saved from my previous life, entirely ignoring the limitless corporate card resting uselessly in my wallet. The rhythmic clacking of the train wheels against the iron tracks felt like a slow, steady heartbeat carrying me away from a beautiful, impossible dream. I watched the sprawling, intimidating estates of New England gradually give way to weathered, salt-stained coastal shanties and dense, working-class neighborhoods. I was returning to the bottom of the world, stepping back into the quiet, invisible life of an archivist. 4 days passed in an absolute, suffocating vacuum of silence. I did not turn on a television to see if the financial markets had reacted to the sudden disappearance of the sterling bride. I did not look at a newspaper. I simply returned to my small, drafty hometown and immediately took a low-paying position, organizing the neglected archives of the local Maritime Historical Society. It was a humble, profoundly unglamorous job housed in a sagging, converted Victorian building that constantly smelled of decaying paper, vanilla, and old binding glue. It was exactly the kind of environment my cousin Gemma would have considered a medieval punishment. To me, it was a necessary, quiet anchor. It was late Tuesday afternoon. The sky outside the frosted windows was already darkening into a bruised purple twilight. I was alone in the main reading room. Kneeling on the worn wooden floorboards, the pine planks were deeply scarred, bearing the heavy, overlapping scuff marks of a century of passing footsteps. I held a damp rag in one hand and a bottle of lemon oil in the other, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn ink stain near the baseboard. The repetitive physical friction offered a strange, meditative peace. The small brass bell, above the front entrance, suddenly chimed. It was a sharp, cheerful sound that violently disrupted the heavy, dusty silence of the reading room. I did not look up immediately. The society rarely saw visitors this late in the day, and I assumed it was the local postman, dropping off a misdelivered parcel. "We are officially closed for the evening, but I can leave the drop box unlocked if you have a return," I called out, quiet, my voice raspy from days of disuse. I scrubbed harder at the dark stain on the wood, keeping my head down. The visitor did not answer. The front door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding home with a heavy metallic finality. The atmospheric pressure in the room shifted instantly. The air suddenly felt dense, vibrating with a heavy, unspoken intensity that made the fine hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A faint, completely unmistakable scent cut through the dusty smell of old paper and lemon polish. It was the sharp, masculine aroma of cedarwood, crushed snow, and cold ozone. My heart completely stopped in my chest. The damp rag slipped from my trembling fingers, dropping onto the worn wooden floor with a soft thud. I turned around slowly, my breath catching painfully in my throat. Julian stood under the archway of the reading room. The immaculate, terrifyingly composed billionaire was completely gone. He looked as though he had been physically torn apart and hastily stitched back together. His massive woolen coat was unbuttoned and hanging unevenly from his broad shoulders. His dark hair was chaotic, windblown, and damp with coastal rain. The sharp, aristocratic angles of his jaw were shadowed with days of dark, rough stubble, and his eyes, usually impenetrable vaults of corporate detachment, were raw, bloodshot, and shining with an absolute, unrestrained desperation. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in jagged, uneven rhythms, as if he had run the entire distance from his sterile marble estate to this crumbling, dusty sanctuary. He took a slow, agonizing step forward, his expensive leather shoes crossing the grimy floorboards. He reached a trembling hand into the deep pocket of his coat. When he pulled his fist out, he slowly opened his large fingers. Resting in the center of his calloused palm was the heavy gold wedding band. "This is how you pay me back," Julian whispered. His voice was a shattered, guttural rasp that seemed to tear its way out of his chest. "By leaving the only real thing in my entire life resting in a pile of dried flowers." I gripped the edge of the nearby mahogany bookshelf, pulling myself up from the floor. My knees felt dangerously weak. I forced myself to stand tall, wrapping my arms tightly around my waist to hold my own splintering pride together. "The debt is paid, Julian," I said, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to keep it even. "You defended your wife in front of your family. You honored the terms of the agreement, but I will not be a charity case kept in a glass cage. And I will absolutely not be a silent placeholder for the woman you were actually supposed to marry." He flinched as if I had struck him across the face. The massive, imposing Tycoon squeezed his eyes shut, a muscle feathering violently beneath his jaw. "Say you're not her," Julian demanded, his voice suddenly dropping into a fierce, breathless plea. He took another rapid step forward, closing the vast distance between us until I had to tilt my head up to look at his face. Say you know you are nothing like her. Gemma was a calculated transaction, a corporate merger meant to look acceptable in a photograph. You. He stopped, his broad chest heaving, as he stared down at me. The defensive walls of winter stone were completely gone, leaving nothing but a profoundly isolated man, standing in the ruins of his own emotional armor. You are the architecture of my entire life, Maeve, he confessed, the absolute truth of his words vibrating in the quiet space between us. When I found that ring in the dirt, the entire estate turned into a tomb. I don't care about the boardrooms. I don't care about the marble. I haven't slept in 4 days, because the silence in that house is completely deafening without the sound of your boots on the stone. I stared at him, tears finally breaking free and spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. I wanted to reach out, to smooth the chaotic hair away from his forehead, to press my hands against his racing heart, but I remained frozen, paralyzed by the overwhelming weight of his vulnerability. Julian did not wait for me to cross the boundary. The man who commanded global markets, who forced rivals to bow to his unyielding demands, took one final step toward me and did the unthinkable. He slowly sank to his knees. His expensive trousers met the dusty, heavily scuffed pine boards. He did not care about the dirt ruining his clothes. He did not care about his pride, his status, or the immense power he wielded in the outside world. He knelt on the floor of a crumbling historical archive, looking up at me with absolute, terrifying surrender. He reached forward, wrapping his large, warm hands gently around my waist, pressing his face into the soft wool of my faded sweater. I felt a violent shudder rack his massive frame. Please, he whispered into the fabric, his voice breaking completely. The greenhouse is just glass and dirt without you. I don't want the empire. I don't want the perfect, sterile life. I just want the woman who bleeds from her cuticles to save a frozen root. I want my home. Please, Maeve, come back and teach me how to live in the dirt. I let out a broken, shattered sob. The immense, heavy armor I had carried since my father's ruin finally hid the cracked and fell away, dissolving into dust on the worn wooden floor. I sank down onto my knees, meeting him in the space between the towering bookshelves. I framed his exhausted, beautiful face in my hands, my thumbs tracing the rough stubble on his jaw, wiping away the single, silent tear that had escaped his dark eyes. There is no contract anymore, Julian. I wept softly, pressing my forehead firmly against his. If I go back as your equal. No ledgers, no debts. There is no contract, he agreed fiercely, his hands sliding up to cup the back of my neck, holding me exactly where he needed me to be. Just us. He reached for my left hand. With trembling, reverent fingers, he slid the heavy gold band back onto my finger, pressing a long, burning kiss to my knuckles. The metal was no longer cold. It was blazing with the heat of his absolute devotion. We did not return to the suffocating grandeur of the East Wing. When we finally traveled back to the coastal estate, the massive stone mansion felt entirely different because we stripped away the sterile rules that had governed it. We fired the corporate landscapers and let the manicured lawns grow wild. We moved my family archives into the West Wing study, placing my fragile, handwritten ledgers directly beside his complex financial reports. People ask sometimes, years later, what truly changed the ruthless, detached Tycoon. They assume it was a massive corporate victory or a sudden shift in global markets. I don't know if I have a good answer for them. All I know is this. The man who once demanded a rigid contract to protect his isolated world now spends his Sunday mornings kneeling in the damp earth of a Victorian greenhouse, carefully pruning hellebores with a custom-engraved hand spade. He doesn't wear a suit on the weekends anymore. He wears a faded, dark woven sweater, and he smells constantly of cedarwood, crushed soil, and fresh rain. Every evening, when the coastal winds batter the heavy glass panes, we sit together in the small, warm kitchen we built near the garden. I don't need a grand ceremony, and I don't need a public declaration of his power. I just need him standing beside the quartz island, holding a chipped mug, pouring a perfectly steeped stream of lavender chamomile tea while he asks me about my day. Write the life you want. I'll meet you there. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again. Take a deep breath. Listen to the rain, and remember that sometimes the most powerful love doesn't demand perfection. It simply waits for you in the silence.